Is it justifiable to indiscriminately bomb civilians while sustaining horrific casualties in order to achieve an unguaranteed result? It's more complicated than you might think. Hello you fine folks, welcome to the Ruiboss channel. Today we're talking about the controversy of the Allied strategic bombing campaign in World War II. This is a topic that is still debated today, with matters of both morality and strategy dominating the conversation. Some scholars think it was a terrible policy, either because of ineffectiveness or collateral damage, while others think it was a necessary and justified path to Allied victory. The goal of this video isn't necessarily to convince you of one side or the other, but rather to present an in-depth study of the topic for you to consider. That doesn't mean that I won't include what I think though, so fight me. But let's get real for a second. If you clicked on this video and you're interested in this topic, I commend you. You're probably someone who cares enough about history to actually do research on it before coming to a conclusion. Today, we live in a world where opinions are usually forged from the shallowest piece of information. But taking the time to dig a little deeper usually proves that the truth is a bit more complicated than the most upvoted answer on Quora. It is my goal in this video to get you closer to the truth. Now, I am by no means an expert, I'm just a dude who likes World War II history and I make videos about it. I view this channel simply as a way for me to share the things that I find interesting, as well as an incentive to challenge me to keep on studying. In this case, I decided to spend a month making a video about one of the most controversial subjects of World War II, so this should be fun. But before we get into the details, a word from I'm just kidding, I don't have a sponsor. Subscribe. To start things off, we need to talk about what the Allied strategic bombing campaign actually was. Unlike close air support or artillery strikes that directly target the enemy, strategic bombing starts at the source by attacking the economy and the people. Targets can include industry, transportation, population centers, etc. The goal of strategic bombing is to disrupt the enemy war machine in order to eliminate his ability to fight. The concept can be divided into precision bombing, where you're specifically targeting something like a factory, and area or carpet bombing, where your target is an entire area, like a city. The second one is where most of the moral controversy comes from, because in that case, citizens are directly being targeted. Now, while the focus of this video is Allied strategic bombing, it's worth noting that the Axis powers had their own campaigns that they waged. The Japanese regularly bombed China, the Germans bombed the British during the Blitz, and so forth. In fact, basically every major belligerent in World War II performed strategic bombing to some extent, so this wasn't a concept unique only to the British and the Americans. That being said, the Brits and the Yanks did it the most systematically, with the most effective aircraft, and achieved the greatest results, so it's them that we're talking about today. So, what exactly was the Allied strategic bombing campaign? Well, there's actually two different campaigns, although we usually only think of one. The first was the Dogged Campaign over occupied Europe from 1942 until early 1945, which is well depicted in the miniseries Masters of the Air. The second is the B-29 campaign over Japan, which lasted from mid-1944 until the end of the war, and culminated in the dropping of atomic weapons. And before you think I'm going to cover two major controversies in one video, we're not going to talk about whether it was justified to drop the nukes on Japan. But the topics do have some overlap. Throughout this video, we'll discuss the campaigns over Europe and Japan in more detail, but first we need to establish what the controversy was in the first place. What's riling up the kids? What started the gang war? Why can't you go out on the streets now without a nerdy professor jumping you with a rap battle about the Norden bomb site? Well, it comes down to two main issues. First, was Allied strategic bombing effective in the first place? And two, was it morally justified? These two debates are going to form the major sections of this video. So, for the first, was Allied strategic bombing effective? To answer that, we need to know what the Allies were trying to do with it in the first place, and we're going to start with the European campaign. From the evacuation of Dunkirk until June of 1944, a period of 4 years, the Allies faced a problem. With no troops in mainland Europe, they had no way of reaching the heart of the German war machine. Sure, there was the war in the Atlantic against U-boats, the mid-war operations into the Mediterranean, and the ever-desperate Eastern Front, but the Allies needed a way to disrupt Germany's ability to wage war. To this end, the Royal Air Force began daylight raids against Germany in 1940 when Britain stood alone in the fight. Terrible losses forced a switch to area night bombing, but the goal remained the same: strike back at Germany and remain in the fight. After the US entered the war, American bombers and aircrew began operating out of England, and the bombing campaign against Germany started to ramp up considerably. In early 1943, the Casablanca Directive was issued to American and British air commanders, which stated, Your primary object will be the progressive destruction and dislocation of the German military, industrial, and economic system, and the undermining of the morale of the German people to a point where their capacity for armed resistance is fatally weakened. Specific industries such as aircraft and U-boat production were outlined as primary targets, and both day and night operations were approved. This accommodated both the American and British approaches to strategic bombing. The Americans believed they could use their heavy B-17s and B-24s to punch through enemy fighters and make daytime precision attacks on industrial targets. However, the British found this unacceptably risky, and they preferred using their advances in radar navigation to carpet bomb cities at night. It should be understood that while there were those who believe air power could win the war by itself, this was not an expectation in the Allies' master plan. The hope was to slowly dismantle German war industry, infrastructure, and morale in order to make an Allied invasion more likely to succeed. With this goal in mind, new targets were added in 1944 as D-Day approached. The Allies began targeting coastal defenses and radar stations, as well as the German rail network in order to slow the response of enemy reinforcements. After D-Day and for the remainder of the European war, the Allies used newfound air supremacy to demolish German industry. They hit oil plants, steel mills, tank factories, infrastructure, and even entire cities. What had begun as a desperate effort to just get in a few hits against Germany had become a torrential downpour of destruction. Now that we know what the Allies were trying to do in Europe, did they succeed? Well, as far as forcing Germany to surrender just because of air power, no, but we already established that that was not a main expectation of the plan. It's also hard to answer if the Allies succeeded in destroying German morale. Certainly, bombing isn't a fun thing, especially if it means the loss of your home, your livelihood, and your family. But consider that Germany stuck it out and didn't surrender until after Berlin had been captured. That takes some spirit to fight for that long. Or perhaps mandatory optimism? Consider the 1947 United States Strategic Bombing Survey, which was a great resource for this video, and I highly recommend you guys check it out. But fair warning, it's like 120 pages long, so keep that in mind.
Reading is love in action.
The survey makes a conclusion that the power of a police state over its people cannot be underestimated. In other words, the Nazis didn't allow their citizens to be sad, or at least to openly show it. There's an account of a German dentist who had a longtime patient in his chair, and the patient asked him what he thought about the war. The dentist didn't disparage Hitler or the Nazi Party or even say anything particularly negative about the war. All he said was that he wasn't sure if Germany would be able to win this fight. The patient then went to the Gestapo, and the dentist was executed for defeatism. In a society like that, most people probably just kept their thoughts to themselves and just kept on working. However, the thing that most people bring up regarding the effectiveness of bombing was accuracy. Admittedly, it was trash. Especially in the early parts of the war, it was a steaming pile of garbage. It was atrocious. It made stormtroopers look like expert marksmen. It made each individual bomb depressed to the point of questioning its very purpose in life as it fell through the air. But accuracy did improve as the war went on. For those of you who like numbers, here are some stats. In June and July of 1941, a survey of British night bombing was performed, which was known as the Butt Report. Unfortunate name. It found that only a third of all sorties were able to navigate to within 5 miles of the target, and less than a third of the bombs that they then dropped landed within 5 miles of the target. From May 1940 to May 1941, half of all bombs fell in open country. The survey I mentioned earlier found that for precision bombing, for the entire war, a total of 20% of bombs fell within 1,000 feet of the target. This was up to 44% for 1945, with a peak of 70% during February of that year. Many people also like to hate on the good old Norden bomb sight used by the US, which in practice was not able to deliver the pickle barrel accuracy that was claimed for it. To be fair, under perfect conditions, the sight worked just fine, and it was an important tool that was certainly a lot better than dropping blind. The problem is that precision bombing basically never had perfect conditions. Air currents, visibility, flak, combat formations, time over target, and inexperienced crewmen made it nearly impossible to cater to what the bomb sight needed. So all this to say, yes, both area and precision bombing left much to be desired in terms of accuracy, but does that matter? Certainly, if precisely 0% of your bombs are hitting the target, it's safe to say that your raids are ineffective. But if you're dropping 300 tons of bombs and 20% of those land within 1,000 feet of a very large target, you're still putting 12,000 pounds of explosives in the target area. So the question isn't so much about accuracy as it is if the raids actually had some sort of measurable effect. During the first stages of the combined bombing offensive, we see something of a paradox. By the end of 1943, German war production was actually stronger than it was before bombing began. But this doesn't necessarily speak to the ineffectiveness of bombing as it does to the jumpstart of the German war economy. German leadership believed in the power of a short war, and since they anticipated a swift victory over Europe and even over Russia, the German war economy really wasn't well established at the beginning of their offensive. In fact, all things considered, it was largely unorganized. But after the disappointing defeat at Moscow in early 1942, Albert Speer was appointed Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production. From that point forward, he would build up the economy even as the Allies tore it down. It was under his management that German production continued to increase until mid-1944. He dispersed different industries in order to make them less vulnerable to air attack, and tapped occupied regions outside of Germany for labor and materiel. In spite of his efforts, Germany still had a great deal of excess capacity throughout the war, meaning it was producing less than what its factories were capable of. But this actually boosted the economy's resilience to bombing, because damaged machinery could be quickly replaced or repaired with unused equipment. All in all, if a given city was bombed, surveys showed that production usually got back to normal within a few weeks. However, just because Germany could recover quickly after a given raid doesn't mean that that raid wasn't accomplishing something. In a war so long and comprehensive as World War II, industrial might is key, and attrition becomes a viable strategy. Air power was perhaps the most efficient use of time and manpower to damage the enemy, and Germany constantly had to spend time and supplies to rebuild. This meant that bombing caused a steady bleed of Germany's resources, and in the long run, it wouldn't be able to keep up with the Allies. Nevertheless, even if early bombing didn't seem to have much impact on the enemy, that wouldn't remain the case for long.
There's a storm coming, buddy.
From mid-1944 until the end of the war, the power of air raids increased greatly, and the German war economy began to noticeably decline. Steel production, oil production, chemicals, utilities, transportation, all of it began to crumble. In particular, when the Allies switched to bombing rail networks in preparation for D-Day, this had a crushing impact on the German war machine. This was because the industries which had been spread out in order to make them less vulnerable to air attacks were now especially reliant on infrastructure. If you don't have railroads, you can't transport raw materials or finished goods, and that really sucks when you need those goods 200 miles away on the front. But it wasn't just this temporary switch to attacking transportation that began destroying Germany. The late war bombing missions became so effective because the Luftwaffe ceased to exist. From December 1943 onwards, bomber sorties were accompanied by the long-ranged P-51 Mustang. They became not just a defense for the B-17s and 24s, but a sword with which to begin cutting through the Luftwaffe. P-47s and 38s, don't worry, I see you too. Allied fighters were given permission to actively engage and hunt down enemy fighters, and German pilots and aircraft began to plummet, literally. Combined with somewhat effective raids on aircraft production, this basically meant the end of the Luftwaffe. This becomes especially obvious when we consider D-Day, where the Germans had a total of 80 operational fighters with which to oppose the 11,600 aircraft that the Allies brought to the party.
10,000.
As soldiers would joke, if you're trying to identify an aircraft, if it's silver, it's American, if it's black, it's the RAF, and if it's not there, it's the Luftwaffe. The destruction of the Luftwaffe was a vital step in winning the European War, a step which Churchill himself credited entirely to the 8th Air Force. Now, while the Luftwaffe was dealt with at this point, anti-aircraft artillery was still a big problem for the bombers, but that brings us to another direct result of the Allied bombing campaign. As the Allies waged their air war over Europe, the Germans were forced to respond by diverting more and more resources to air defense. This included civil defenses like fire brigades and bomb shelters, but it more importantly included the famous 88mm flat gun. The 88 was a versatile artillery piece that was not only good for shooting down planes, but also an effective tank killer. On the Eastern Front, the 88 was used to devastating effect against Russian armor, and Russian tank crews came to fear and despise it. However, as the Germans in turn came to fear and despise Allied bombers, they began diverting 88s and the Luftwaffe from the Eastern Front to Western occupied Europe. Artillery production shifted as well, with more and more resources going towards 88s, and by 1944, an estimated 1,200 88s remained in the Eastern Front, while 7,000 sat in Germany. The importance of this cannot be understated. In World War II, the Eastern Front was the anvil on which the German army was beaten. 80% of German casualties came from fighting the Soviets, and something like half of all World War II deaths occurred in the Eastern Front. Stalin may not have gotten a true second front as soon as he wanted, but the Allies created a de facto second front in the air that definitely assisted the Soviets. So, was strategic bombing over Europe effective? I would say it undeniably was. Even if Germany's industrial output wasn't seriously reduced for much of the war, Allied bombing slowly but surely bled Germany dry, whether directly or indirectly. But what about the Pacific theater? How effective was strategic bombing against the Japanese? Well, the bombing campaign looked a little bit different in the Pacific. Since this was an ocean war rather than a land war, strategic bombing didn't seriously come into play until late 1944 when the US was closing in on Japan. The debate over strategic bombing in the Pacific revolves mainly around the firebombing campaign of the Japanese home islands, so that is what we'll discuss here. At risk of oversimplifying things, I'm going to run through this section a bit more quickly, as the bombing campaign over Japan was shorter, it was a bit more straightforward, and we don't need to rehash general themes that we've already talked about in the Europe section. As the US slowly dealt with the Imperial Japanese Navy and captured island after island, it also completed a new, state-of-the-art long-range bomber, the B-29 Superfortress. With the vast distances presented by the Pacific Ocean, the incredible range of the B-29 would be needed to strike at the heart of Japan. And as US forces discovered more and more just how terrible and costly an island invasion was, especially after Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the American brass hoped that Japan could be forced to surrender without the need for a final invasion. The goal of strategic bombing in the Pacific became to either bomb Japan into submission, unlike in Europe, or to thoroughly soften resistance if an invasion was unavoidable. In this case, bombers wouldn't have to worry as much about destroying the Japanese economy because Japan's resources were largely imported. The US was already bringing Japan's economy to its knees simply by destroying the Japanese merchant fleet and blockading the home islands. Bombers would be used primarily to break the will of the Japanese people, though this would still include attacks on home industry. B-29s began flying sorties from the Mariana Islands in November of 1944, dropping bombs from 30,000 feet on targets in the aircraft industry. While bombs that struck their targets proved quite effective, the US quickly found that accuracy was abysmal. In this first stage, only 10% of bombs were landing in the target area. This was due to the fact that precision bombing from 30,000 feet was basically impossible, as Japan had a powerful jet stream that carried bombs off target. In addition, most of the air crews were inexperienced, especially with the brand new B-29s. However, in January of 1945, Major General Curtis LeMay was transferred to the Marianas to take over the 21st Bomber Command. He had different ideas for how to go about bombing Japan, and arranged for the B-29s to be used in a seemingly counterintuitive way. Instead of the high altitudes they were originally designed for, the B-29s would bomb at night at altitudes of 5,000 to 9,000 feet. Japan had an unimpressive night fighter force, and its anti-aircraft defenses weren't well suited for speedy, low-level attacks, so the B-29 could attack with ease. The low altitudes not only allowed for much more accurate attacks, but also increased engine power, letting the superfortresses carry a greater bomb load. However, perhaps the most important aspect of all was the switch to incendiary bombs. Since Japan's cities were largely made of wood and paper, firebombing would have a devastating and indeed hellish effect. On March 9, 1945, the first attack of this kind was made, and nearly 1,700 tons of incendiary bombs were dropped on Tokyo. The result was terrifying. 16 square miles of Tokyo was incinerated, and an estimated 100,000 people died in a span of 3 hours, making it more deadly than the atomic bombing of Nagasaki. Crewmen of the last B-29s in the formation, as they passed over the target, even recounted that they were able to smell burning flesh, even that high up in the air. The historian Victor Davis Hanson has suggested that this attack was the most destructive 24 hours in military history. These attacks continued until Japan's informal surrender in August, by which time the firebombing had killed as many as 500,000 people and made 30% of Japan's urban population homeless. While it horrifically killed civilians, this bombing technique also proved to be one of the best and only ways to damage Japan's home industry. Most of Japan's war production had been spread and embedded throughout its cities rather than in large centralized factories. Unfortunately, the only way to destroy the war effort was necessarily to bomb and destroy civilian centers. Whether the goal was reducing morale or disrupting industry, the tactic would remain firebombing. In any case, the will of the Japanese people was quickly broken. Post-war surveys show that even before surrender, 64% of the Japanese population were unwilling to resist further, primarily because of the air attacks. Many now believe that the use of atomic bombs wasn't even a main factor that forced Japan to surrender, but was rather the radioactive cherry on top of a firebomb sundae. In light of this, it's easy to say that strategic bombing over Japan was plenty effective. The US had set out to avoid the horrific casualties of a mainland invasion, and they had succeeded with the terrible might of the B-29. So with all of that being laid out, by my humble estimation, the Allied strategic bombing campaigns had accomplished what they set out to do. Maybe you came to the same conclusion, maybe not. Let me know in the comments below, but make sure to use all caps so that other people will argue with you, and that will increase this video's engagement. But that leaves the more important question. Considering the cost to civilians and Allied air crews, was strategic bombing justified? Now, before we really get into this, I want to encourage you to withhold judgment a little bit and consider the context. It's pretty easy for us to sit in safe homes with the world in relatively good shape and say that killing civilians is never acceptable. But the 1940s was a different time, it was a desperate time, and the survival of the Allies was not a guarantee. We know how it all turned out, but we weren't there in the middle of it, and we didn't have to make the decisions that the Allied leaders did. But that doesn't mean we can't discuss it, and indeed we should. And to do that, let me just reiterate the overall purpose of the bombing campaigns. It wasn't to kill civilians just for the sake of killing civilians, but to break the enemy's will to resist and save Allied lives in the process. I'm going to start off with the main reasons people condemn strategic bombing, mainly because they're straightforward and quick to go over. First and foremost is the issue of collateral damage, which is just a euphemism for killing civilians. Civilian casualties are an inherent aspect of strategic bombing, whether directly or as a byproduct. In area bombing, the very purpose is to harm civilians, or at the very least to destroy their homes and livelihood. Even with precision bombing, the factories that are being targeted don't just run by themselves, they're going to be filled with workers. If you want numbers, estimates range widely, but something like 300,000 to 600,000 civilians were killed in the Europe bombing campaign, and perhaps 300,000 to 500,000 in the bombing over Japan, not including the atomic bombs. So potentially 1 million or more civilians were killed in Allied strategic bombing. In addition, 7.5 million Germans were made homeless, with similar numbers for Japan. Japan often gets special attention in this argument since firebombing was the preferred strategy for its destruction. Several German cities were firebombed as well, such as Hamburg and Dresden, but Japan received the brunt of it. Certainly, any death by bombing would be terrible, but dying in a firestorm is particularly horrific, and such was the case for hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians. Even Curtis LeMay, the architect of the campaign, later said, "I suppose if I had lost the war, I would have been tried as a war criminal." Another argument is the great toll taken not just on enemy civilians, but on Allied air crews in the process. The Japanese campaign was much less severe, but nearly 160,000 aviators were killed in the air offensive over Europe, with just under 80,000 each for the US and Great Britain. RAF Bomber Command suffered close to a 50% mortality rate, and the US 8th Air Force lost 26,000 men, more than the total number of US Marines killed during the war. In 1943, an aviator in the 8th Air Force only had a 25% chance of completing a tour without being killed, captured, or seriously wounded. The US lost 8,000 heavy bombers over Europe, and the Allies together lost 40,000 total aircraft. This casualty rate is particularly hard to accept considering how inaccurate bombing was, and many don't think it was worth committing half of your aircrews to die just to miss with 80+% of your bombs. Considering the great cost to both civilians and Allied air crews, some have argued that the resources going into the bombing campaigns could have been diverted and used elsewhere. Perhaps in improving naval forces and further dealing with U-boats, or maybe in producing specialized, accurate medium bombers for precision strikes. What if the Allies instead focused on more effective and better equipped ground forces for the upcoming invasion? What if we just even sent more resources to the Russians, who were already wearing down German troops? Could any or all of these have been less wasteful, less costly, and less war-crimey than the bombing campaign? And finally, a specific objection for the Pacific Theater was the fact that it's estimated that naval blockades alone would have reduced Japan's economy by 40 or 50% by August of 1945. So was strategic bombing even necessary in the first place? Could America just have starved out Japan without burning its citizens to death? Well, to start on the defending points of strategic bombing, let's deal with some of these criticisms. As far as forcing Japan to surrender just by blockade, remember that many Japanese civilians lost hope specifically because of air attack. Before the firebomb raids, the Japanese military was bent on holding out, and they weren't just sitting idly by in the meantime. Kamikaze attacks were taking place up until the end of July, the infamous Unit 731 was still performing horrific experiments, American troops were still dying, and civilians and POWs were still being mistreated and killed. The war needed to end, it needed to end quickly, and the only way to do so without receiving the estimated hundreds of thousands of casualties in a ground invasion was through air attack. As far as diverting resources from the Europe campaign to some other pursuits, there's some skepticism. It's easy to suggest that the Allies could have just focused on something else, but it's much more difficult to actually imagine a practical alternative. The advantage of improved naval and ground forces may have meant basically nothing if the German war economy was left to thrive. Not to mention that you now still have the Luftwaffe to deal with, and the tide may have turned against the Soviets if the Germans weren't busy repelling air attacks at home. The fact is that air power had become a decisive element of warfare by the time of World War II, and long-range bombing was the way in which it was expressed offensively. The historian James Holland has argued that bombing was the most efficient use of manpower to attack the enemy, and even if air crewmen took terrible casualties, their efforts ultimately saved the lives of far more soldiers on the ground. But that brings us to a very important point, because the bombing campaigns didn't just save Allied soldiers, it probably saved far more Allied civilians. We've been doing numbers a lot, but let me give you a few more because we need some perspective. So ask yourself, how do you picture the death toll of World War II? Where did the most deaths happen? I'd wager that most people think about the Holocaust, the atrocities committed by the Japanese against China, and then of course civilian deaths from bombing, but it was mostly soldiers who died, right?
Guess again, Tubby.
Estimates vary, but total deaths from World War II are something like 65 to 75 million. Close to 2/3 of that number, if not more, were civilians. Of those civilian deaths, something like 80% were committed by the Axis powers. This means that easily more than half of all deaths from World War II were just Allied civilians, numbering something like 35 to 40 million. That's not at all to make light of the 1 million people who died in the bombing campaigns, but that number certainly pales in comparison. So it didn't just come down to a choice between Allied soldiers and enemy civilians, but Allied soldiers, countless Allied civilians, and enemy citizens. Ultimately, we're left with something of a trolley problem, except you're choosing between an enormous number of your own troops and people and a much smaller number of the enemy civilians. The philosopher Anthony Grayling has argued that the Axis powers were criminal regimes, thus the Allies had a moral duty to win the war, both for their own people and for the innocence of the world. To be fair, Grayling doesn't actually believe strategic bombing was justified, but I would then argue that saving Allied lives at the expense of the enemies is indeed justified. And if you're grumpy that I'm now pushing my perspective, here's the time code for when I said I would. But we're still not done. These past few points all assume it's not okay to kill civilians in war, and I'm probably getting myself in some hot water here.
Be very careful with the next thing you say.
But is that always the case? Or at the very least, is that something the Allies should be condemned for? The simple fact is, civilians have always died in war. War is war, and collateral damage is unavoidable, especially with the advent of explosives which kill indiscriminately. But what about specifically targeting civilians? There's a great article from 1968 called The Ethics of Bombing, written by a retired RAF Air Marshal named Sir Robert Soundby. In it, Soundby explains that in the Middle Ages, there arose a system of conventional warfare fought between monarchies. This system involved pitched battles and strict rules of soldiering, and local peasants were largely unaffected by who won or lost a power struggle. There was a clear line between the professional soldier and the non-combatant. But this changed during the French Revolution when warfare became a thing of the people and conscription became a wide practice. War returned to being between entire nations and not just a monarch's armies. So if an entire nation is at war, are its people valid targets? We like to use the expression military target, but Soundby suggests that that definition is a bit fuzzier than we might think. His logic goes something like this. If an artillery piece and its crew and the ammunition it uses are all military targets, what about the truck and the depot that supply ammunition? If those are military targets too, then what about the factories that produce the ammunition? And then what about the workers in those factories and the raw materials and utilities that go into the factories? What about the homes that those workers live in? Or, to go a different route, what about a conscript that didn't want to be holding a weapon in the first place? This reasoning can go on, and I don't think it's okay to end up calling a baby a military target just because they could potentially become a soldier, but the point is this. War is hell, and if you're fighting a moral war, ethical sacrifices may be necessary to advance that war. But that's the debate, isn't it? Personally, it took me a long time to really decide how I feel about this, even after I'd completed all the research for the video. Ultimately, if it wasn't obvious, I think that the Allied bombing campaigns were both effective and justified. Probably the main thing that would convince me otherwise is if the Allies had a viable alternative that they could have pursued that would have ended the war quickly, and wouldn't have meant the deaths of hundreds of thousands more Allied soldiers. But what do you think? Was the campaign unjustified? Was it even ineffective? Was there something else the Allies could have done that I might be convinced by? Let me know in the comments. There's a video on YouTube where 4 British philosophers and historians debate the morality of this, and while it's not comprehensive, I personally found the video really insightful, so I will link it in the description for your perusal. Thank you guys for sticking around this long. I really hope this video gave you plenty to think about in order to form your own opinions on the topic. It was a beast making this thing, and the debate even goes well beyond what I included here, but if you're a good student of history, you'll keep researching anyway. However, if you want to stick around the channel, here are some more videos you might enjoy. You can show your appreciation by liking and do the subscribe so you stay tuned in for all future content. Because there's more to come and you can't stop me. I'll see you guys in the next video. Ruibas out.